All right. Okay, thank you for your patience, everybody. Welcome to the San Anselmo Library's virtual Art Talk Tuesday. It's 3 contemporary women artists with Avril Angevine. I'm Sariana, the Adult Services Librarian at the San Anselmo Library. And before we begin, I'd like to thank the Friends of the Library and the Library Parcel Tax for sponsoring this program and all library programs. Everyone will remain muted until the end of the presentation. If you have a question for Avril, please type it into the chat box. I will be monitoring the chat and alert Avril to any questions received there. Or if you'd like, you can wait till after the program and we'll do a raise the hand and I will unmute and we'll figure out all that fun stuff at the end of the program. So, and also thank you so much for your patience and understanding with our technology today. We found that technology can be very fickle. So I have good news about that. If for whatever reason you're cut off or get taken off the Zoom meeting, I will be sending the recorded link to everybody later today. So I'll expect an email from me with the recording later today. Our speaker today is Avril Angevine. Avril is an independent art lecturer and teaches English and humanities at local colleges. She's also a museum guide at the SF MoMA and Oakland Museum. Her particular interests are modern art and California art and design. Avril has a website with short videos about people and movements in California art. You can find that at talkingaboutart.net. I'll also include this link in the chat box for you all to see. Please join me in welcoming Avril Angevine back to our virtual Art Talk Tuesday. Woo! Yay!
Okay, Sariana, thank you so much for that enthusiastic welcome, and happy to be back here in this forum with you to talk about 3 contemporary women artists whose work I think you will like. Slideshow from beginning. If I got that up there, there we go. Okay, so today I want to introduce you to 3 important women artists working today. They are mid and kind of later career people who have had lots of museum shows and are really well established and well known. They work in different media. They come from different places, but all 3 as postmodern artists engage with social conditions and especially women's roles in their work. They often aim to shock, and in this they are successful, but they also want you to reflect on the world we all inhabit, and I hope you'll agree that they're successful in that quest too. So get ready for an hour for a slightly bumpy ride. Hopefully you will enjoy what you're going to see in the works of Cindy Sherman, Kara Walker, and Doris Salcedo. So now if you're at all familiar with the contemporary art world, so I'm sure you are, you know that women artists, as well as artists of color, have received a great deal of long overdue attention in the last few years. And it seems that there are as many and possibly more young female artists as male gaining museum and gallery attention. This, of course, is a staggering change. Back in the old days, the 1970s, when I was a student intently studying H.W. Jansen's massive definitive art history text, it seemed that there were no women artists at all. And in fact, Jansen mentioned no women artists, not Georgia O'Keeffe, not Mary Cassatt, nobody, until the 1986 edition. The few women that snuck in were from artistic families. That is, they were either the daughters of, the wives of, the mistresses of, or sometimes the models for male artists. Now, of course, we've reached a point where someplace like the Baltimore Museum of Art, major art museum, declared that they were only going to collect works by women artists in 2020 and devote most of their shows last year, were female-centric to female artists. So we've come a long way, baby. How did this happen? Won't surprise you that the seeds of this change were found in the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s, when women began agitating towards ignorant men for an equal place in the world. This was the decade that saw the birth of Ms. Magazine, in whose pages Alice Walker described her discovery of the now canonical, but at the time completely unknown writer Zora Neale Hurston. Art historians too search the record for forgotten women artists and unearth some gems like Frida Kahlo, who was better known at that time as Mrs. Diego Rivera. 2008, SF MoMA had an exhibition of her works, and I believe it is still the best attended exhibition they've ever mounted. Now, in addition, there were feminist art programs, such as the one developed by Judy Chicago at Fresno State in 1970, which trained women to study women artists and make art about women's experiences. The group opened a similar program at Cal Arts in Los Angeles the following year, where they staged Woman House, probably the first feminist art installation in an abandoned Victorian house near Hollywood. So this capitalized on the association of women and houses, and like a decorator's show house, it featured rooms designed by different artists, rooms like the lipstick bathroom by Camille Gray, or the menstruation bathroom by Judy Chicago, or the bridal staircase by Kathy Huberland, and many more equally startling. The exhibit was only open to women on the first day, but eventually logged 10,000 or so visitors. But the most powerful step forward for the inclusion of women in the art canon came in 1971, when art historian Linda Nochlin published her groundbreaking must-read essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? So in it, she explodes the myth of artistic genius, the time-tested explanation of great artistic achievement, which was kind of invented in the Renaissance. The idea of artistic genius like this still had traction when she wrote, and to an extent it still does today. Now, Nochlin doesn't deny that some individuals, men and women, have exceptional inborn talent, but she claimed that social conditions, not individual talent or lack of it, explained why women had failed to achieve success in the visual arts. There they go. First, she reminds us pre-20th century artists learned their craft, and painting was a craft, by spending several years as grunt work apprentices, grinding paint and preparing canvases and so forth, a path simply not open to women. Young artists would also travel to Rome to copy the masters. Again, not an option for women by and large. And when the art academies began in the 16th century, that training too was barred to women, so that even skilled women painters had no opportunity to draw from live nude models. So this interesting work by Johann Zoffany from the 18th century depicts the British Royal Academy in 1771, when there were actually two female members, Angelica Kauffman and Mary Moser. Can you find them in the painting? Yes, there they are up on the wall. So they're acknowledged, but they couldn't actually be present because their male colleagues are studying a nude body. And of course, you need to study nude bodies. You need to know anatomy pretty well to create the kind of giant canvases of mythological and historical subjects, like this one, Benjamin West's Death of General Wolfe at Quebec in the 18th century. And this was what you did to become a famous artist and get big commissions. You had to do these giant history paintings. Now, women, if they painted at all, generally restricted themselves to the less important genres like portraits, interior scenes, landscapes, and such. But it is kind of interesting, I think, that nowadays most of us find history paintings of this sort kind of tiresome and bombastic, and we prefer the kind of works that women did anyway. But Nochlin explains why women who were connected to men in one way or another were able to achieve success or attain success. Some women had fathers who were painters, like Artemisia Gentileschi, who was the first woman member of the Academy of Art and Design in Florence, or Rosa Bonheur, whose family was so artistically distinguished that Sir Francis Galton used it as an example of hereditary genius in his essay of the same name. Interesting, Bonheur was a specialist in painting animals, so she knew the anatomy of a horse probably better than that of a man. Other female artists so these two probably did have inherited artistic talent, but there were other female artists who married or had other kind of social connections with artists. And in this category, we find the two great women impressionists, Mary Cassatt and Berthe Morisot. Both of them came from wealthy families, and they received sketching and painting lessons as a necessary accomplishment to a proper bourgeois spouse, though of course the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts would have been closed to them. But Berthe Morisot married Eugène Manet, brother of the painter, and Mary had a close, apparently platonic friendship with Edgar Degas. So both of them lived and worked in artistic circles. But a really interesting character actually is Judith Leyster of the Netherlands, who strangely did most of her painting before she married the much better known painter Jan Mense Molenaar. She became the first woman member of the Haarlem Painters Guild in 1633. And shortly after, it's recorded that she had 3 male apprentices. Her work was popular during her lifetime, but she disappeared from view until 1893, when this work, which was formerly attributed to Frans Hals, and you can see why, was actually identified as hers. Now, the social connection these women had to artist talk, artistic thinking, studios, art supplies, helped make them all artists. And Nochlin really seals her thesis, I think, by asking this question: why are there so few aristocrats among artists? I mean, after all, the wealthy commissioned, bought, and collected art. Why didn't they make any? No one would suggest that aristocrats lacked talent or were constitutionally unable to achieve genius. Although actually, maybe you should ask that question. Many aristocrats, like many women, dabbled in sketching and painting, but rarely did they work as artists. And the reason, of course, is the same as it was for women. Social conditions prevented it. Art was dirty work, a hard job, one that required years of subordination, almost slaving, something wealthy aristocrats are not partial to. Few artists were peasants either. Generally, artists came from the working middle classes like tailors, jewelers, and saddle makers. Now, Nochlin's essay inspired the Guerrilla Girls, a group of feminist artists and art world people formed in New York in the 1980s to paste a series of provocative billboards around town. Here's a famous one that I'm sure you remember seeing. And perhaps as a response to their shocking revelation that 85% of the nudes in the Met are of women, Helen Gurley Brown came to the rescue by publishing the first male nude centerfold in Cosmo in 1972. Game on, girls. Burt Reynolds, RIP, there we go. So this is also in the 70s that the world sees for the first time the work of Cindy Sherman, a woman who, while not identifying herself as a feminist, really created the modern conversation about women's identity, women's roles, how the world perceives us, and how we respond to that perception. Sherman created the transformative selfie, a self-created image recording a contrived personality, common enough in our era, but really new in the 1970s. And in fact, although she's classed as a photographer, it's fair to say that Sherman's photographs merely document a kind of performance in which she serves as model, makeup artist, hairdresser, wardrobe mistress. Basically, she brings to her work the skills that any image-conscious woman has mastered by junior high school, but she uses them in the service of art. And I like to think of her in a way as being similar to someone like Betty Davis. And you believe this is Betty Davis when she was young, who was unique among classic Hollywood stars in allowing herself to appear as plain, even ugly, for instance, in Now Voyager, in some of her film roles. Similarly, Sherman creates characters who are intriguing, but often repellent, sometimes disfigured, and often undignified. And now in her most recent work, she has to confront her own aging. She's in her mid-60s, and in fact, she does. So Sherman was born in 1954 on Long Island, the youngest by 9 years of 5 children. And she has said that she began dressing up as a way of kind of attracting family attention. As an art student at Buffalo State College, she switched from painting to photography, and even as a student began using herself as a model. Now, in doing this, she claims to have been inspired by artists like Vito Acconci and Bruce Nauman, and for that matter, Anna Mendieta, people who were using their own bodies in their art at that time. So here's one of her very early works, a series of photographs showing her transforming herself step by step. So at the upper left, that's how she looked. Remember those glasses from the 70s? And little by little, we see all the way at the bottom right, the full transformation. This is what she's interested in. And another early work of hers done in 1976, but not printed until later, are a series called Bus Stop, showing herself dressed up as typical bus riders as she imagines them. So you can see that she even, on the left, she dresses up as a man as well. And she also, among her early works, is a stop motion animated film called Doll Clothes that depicts herself as a cutout figure trying to escape her confinement in a plastic folder, trying on a bunch of dresses, and there's a big hand that comes in and grabs her and places her back in her plastic prison. So this goes way back in her practice. So after college, Sherman moves to New York and created the series that really established her reputation, the Untitled Film Stills. So this is a series of 69 8.5 by 11 black and white images that are reminiscent of scenes from Italian neorealist films or American film noir. Some of them look like they might come from Hitchcock. They often strike you as, isn't that in Psycho? Isn't that in Rear Window? No, they're not actual recreations, but what they're recreating are the feminine images, the stereotypes and so forth that you would see in those films. She creates a whole range of characters from seductresses to librarians and so forth. Got a librarian for you there, Sariano. In different locations, many of them were shot in New York, but this one, which is quite famous, named Hitchhiker, was actually taken by her father while they were on a family vacation to Arizona. Way to go, Dad. Way to support your artistic daughter. Now, the figures in these photographs are generally alone, and often they're fairly expressionless. But like the women in the films that they are parodying, like for instance, this woman, here's a Cindy version, or this Sophia Loren, and here's a Cindy version. They're defying conventional marriage and family situations that were women's reality in this era. Now, these photographs originally sold for $50 a piece. In 1995, MoMA New York purchased the whole series for $1 million, so they became very valuable. By the 80s, later on, she began to explore other sources of female imagery, namely the centerfold, fashion photos, art history, horror films, and so forth. And she switched from black and white to color and to larger formats in her work. So we see a group, an interesting group called centerfolds, or the horizontals. There's one from 1981. So this is a series of 12 large-scale 2-foot by 4-foot photographs that were initially commissioned but never used by Art Forum magazine. So in them, she's either on the floor or in a bed. And really, because of the very horizontal format, that works the best here. This one, they have a narrative suggestion to them. This one, to me, I love the plaid skirt. This is like Catholic schoolgirl trapped in the cellar, somebody's knocking at the door, right? So they are images of, if not terror, at least nervousness and discomfort. And she said about these, some of them I hope would seem very psychological. While I'm working, I might feel as tormented as the person I'm portraying. There she is, waiting for the phone to ring, right? And she has another series from this time in which, this is a little bit unusual, she takes up her body takes up the whole frame. And as you can see here, she is not made up. There's no props, nothing but lighting and this pink robe. And so I think these generally suggest kind of an after sex image, or somebody resting from a porn shoot, something like that, that she's working with. And on that subject, by the 80s, she gets into a series of pornography, anti-pornography images, where she's kind of responding to the art scene in the 80s, when there were lots of controversies with the NEA about funding for art because it was so nasty. This is when we have the Piss Christ of Andres Serrano, and when we have Jeff Koons, I'm going to show you his in a minute, doing Made in Heaven. So these are sexual erotic works made with medical dummies. And let me just show you by comparison, this is what Jeff Koons was doing at the time, this series called Made in Heaven, where he's got these staged photographs of himself and his wife at the time, Ilona Staller, who was an Italian porn star who became a member of the Italian parliament. Like, you can't make this up. So this is him. And Cindy's response to this kind of situation. And in a sense, people say she was kind of responding to her celebrity, almost challenging people to buy these works and so forth. It's a moment that is not my favorite aspect of her work. By the late 80s and into the 90s, she was doing different things. She got into a series of large color photographs, restaging European portraits, sort of an art history tradition, history portraits, she calls them. Here's a couple, like here, where, as you can see, you've got the background, but you can see particularly in the image on the right, that's a false breast. The whole front of her is fake. And in the one on the left, it's harder to see. I think she looks like Meryl Streep there, but down at the bottom right of the photograph, her foot is actually kind of a monster foot that you would get for Halloween or something. So she's totally into these prosthetic devices. As far as I know, these portraits are generally not based, as in the film stills, on a specific image, except this one is. This one is the Caravaggio, the sick Bacchus, okay, which is Cindy Sherman and which is Caravaggio. Of course, that's Cindy's version on the right. The arm there, the muscled arm, is really interesting, and I don't know whether that's fake, but I think if you look at the leg, you can see that that's a woman's leg. Looks different than the Caravaggio on the left, and that's kind of fun that she did. So these are some where she also did a hideous, pardon me for judgment, series of clowns. You know, there she really goes wild with these. And in fact, I remember when this exhibit, her exhibit was up several years ago at SF MoMA, I remember people talking about creating a poster for the exhibit, and somebody suggested the clowns, but that was completely out because they frighten people so much. They are awful, they're scary. In the year 2000, she did a show that debuted at the Gagosian Gallery in Beverly Hills. Here she's gone back to using just her own face and body as a jumping off point to create these large scale photographs of fictional characters. And they're all set up to look like celebrity headshots that people who are interested in getting into acting have to do. And apparently they seem to be, in Sherman's mind, they're all kind of Hollywood types. And in fact, they offended a lot of people in Beverly Hills. Nevertheless, they all sold before the show opened. I just wanted to show you, is this by Cindy Sherman? No, this is a real celebrity headshot. That's Kirsten Dunst. So that's the kind of thing she's transmitting there. It's interesting. Then we move forward. These are perhaps a bit more subtle. The society portraits, a bit more subtle. Do we feel bad for these women? Do you want to laugh at them? So now she's up at a time where she is still dressing herself, making herself up, but clearly she's using photoshopped backgrounds, especially visible in this one, which is really interesting. So she's here. She's also unbelievably done a lot of work for fashion houses. Despite hating fashion photography. As she has said, she has done work for Prada, I think that's Prada on the left, for Dolce & Gabbana, Marc Jacobs, Balenciaga, and Chanel, 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 Chanel. These are done with the backdrop is Iceland. I think she went there herself and took the pictures, but you know, the figures in front are obviously dropped in front. There's a couple. All right. And so what she's doing now, she has an Instagram account with, yeah, where she is doing the same thing, but this is all done obviously computer wise. So she is no longer making herself up to create these images. She's just manipulating. She's got this image, and what she's doing right now, the most recent work, is a new direction for her. She's having some tapestries made in Belgium. They're the first non-photographic work she's actually ever made, and they're from images that were originally posted on her Instagram feed, which didn't work as blown up photo images. They're just not sharp enough, but they do work as tapestries. And as she says, a tapestry is a really interesting early form of pixelization because it's all tiny threads, obviously woven together. So Cindy Sherman is still at it, still operating, still doing interesting things. She's the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant, and her work is endlessly inventive of these characters. And our next artist, like Cindy Sherman, is a MacArthur Genius Grant winner, the youngest ever. Her award came when she was only 27, and she is Kara Walker. Walker has created a powerful body of work that examines the central event in American history, not just for African Americans, but for everyone. And that, of course, is the peculiar institution of slavery and its repercussions, which can be felt even today. Slavery was, of course, an economic, social, and political system designed to deny humanity to an important subset of society, the segment that actually produced the South's wealth through their plantation labor. Walker has focused a laser-like beam on the experiences of women in slavery who were denied control even of their own sexuality. Of course, today we are much more aware of the extent to which slave women were raped and or bore illegitimate children to their masters. And it's been, of course, an important theme in the work of contemporary African-American writers like Toni Morrison and Alice Walker. But Kara Walker looks to art history as well as to folklore and tradition in creating her works. They can be shocking, and what we're going to talk about today will include some sexually provocative images, so kind of be aware of that. So Kara Walker's early life set the pattern for her work, just as Cindy Sherman's did. Walker was born in Stockton, California, where her father taught painting at the University of the Pacific. So there they are. He's somebody who's been an important influence on her. But when she was 13, he took a position at Georgia State University, and the family moved to the small town of Stone Mountain, Georgia. Now, if the name is familiar to you, it's because it was known as the birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan. So transition to life in the Deep South was tough for Walker. The local Black children found her California accent way too white, while of course the white children still regarded her as Black. She became a loner and retreated into observation, which is actually not a bad place really for an artist to be. She viewed her life at that time as a kind of weird performance in a weird spectacle that she had just kind of happened into. At the Atlanta College of Art, she tried to escape her situation by doing abstract painting, thinking that works that called attention to her race were too obvious, too expected. But in graduate school at Rhode Island School of Design, she abandoned abstract painting and began a study of the racial and gender issues that she had been avoiding, slavery and interracial romance. She was inspired in her task by artists like the early 20th century German expressionist Max Beckmann, who ripped off the facade of German bourgeois behavior in works like this one called The Family from 1920. He's interested in exposing the horrific reality underneath polite society. And Walker, too, wanted to look underneath the sort of gone with the wind image of the South, Southern hospitality and mint juleps and so forth, to expose what was really going on. And by the mid-90s, she had hit upon the medium of the traditionally proper Victorian silhouette to explore the intersection of race, gender, and sexuality. So her silhouettes, which are pasted directly on the walls of a gallery or museum, combine the epic scale of history painting, the bite of political satire, and frankly, the shock and discomfort of pornography. And they usually have long titles too. That's why I put this one up here, reminiscent of 19th century book titles. So she got immediate attention in 1994 with her first one here, a 50-foot long silhouette installation titled Gone, an historical romance of a civil war as it occurred between the dusky thighs of one young negress and her heart. So for an idea of the scale of this work, here it is with visitors at MoMA, New York. And I'll show you a couple of close-ups of some of the images in there. This one and this one. So let's look back at the original here and let's think about this work a little bit. What's going on here? First of all, it's a narrative. It's telling us a kind of story about the dusky young negress struggling between love and sex, between her heart and her thighs. It's a story about the sexual domination of female slaves, the children who result from these liaisons, and the emotional cost of the whole thing. So in a first glance at this, we can say that in a way, like what Cindy Sherman does, she's creating a narrative. And the size of it makes it difficult to ignore. And later works, such as this one called Darkytown Insurrection in 2000, she's actually brought in colored lights that project a visitor's shadows on the wall, which brings us into the work even more forcefully and maybe makes us think of movies, think of Gone with the Wind or something. And of course, the black and white of the original is starkly graphic. It really reduces the subject to its most basic terms. Now, of course, the silhouettes are caricatures with big lips and pigtails and so forth. No suggestion of individual difference or individual character. Even the landscape is stereotypical with, dripping live oaks and the moss and the moon and all this. So really what we find is an incredible tension between the gentleness and gentility of the traditional silhouette, usually used to render delicate and easily recognizable portraits, between that and the violence of these images. And Walker says of them, the silhouette says a lot with very little information, but that's also what the stereotype does. So I saw the silhouette and the stereotype as linked. Of course, while the stereotype can communicate with a lot of people and a lot of people can understand it, it also reduces difference, reduces diversity to that stereotype. Now, Walker's predecessors in this type of politically charged art include William Hogarth, whose Marriage à la Mode presented the hypocrisy of the English aristocracy in the 18th century. In this one, and they're in a series, it's a narrative, just like Walker's. This is a young couple, clearly in an arranged marriage. You do that to secure wealth, of course. They're obviously disinterested in each other and have both been involved in a sexual escapade separately. We can see there going on. I think for the woman, it's the marriage. I think that's her accountant over there. They've had a violin lesson and so forth. Or in someone like Francisco Goya, whose works may be among the most pointed and disturbing in Western art, where we see the artist reacting to the cruelty of war and to the torments of his own mind in the image on the right. And Walker has also, of course, been influenced by African-American artists, from Romare Bearden to Robert Colescott, a Californian artist here who has brought African-American figures into classic paintings. In this case, we have here George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware, and he's done it by using these stereotypical images, and she also mines this field. Now, Walker's most monumental work to date, in which she moves from 2 to 3 dimensions, was installed in the abandoned Domino Sugar Factory in Brooklyn in 2014, and it's called A Subtlety, also known as the Marvelous Sugar Baby. There it is. It's subtitled An Homage to the Unpaid and Overworked Artisans Who Have Refined Our Sweet Tastes from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino Sugar Refining Plant. So a subtlety, by the way, was once a luxury, an edible sugar table decoration, kind of like we have ice sculptures today. Sugar, of course, became more widely available due in large part to slave labor. So Walker's not so subtle subtlety here is a 35-foot tall polystyrene sculpture coated in sugar, so it's not entirely sugar, depicting a woman with African features with the wrap on her head in the form of a sphinx, surrounded by 15 attendants who are little blackamoor figures produced in China. Now, as you can well imagine, let's see some other views of it. There's how large it is. And here she is in front of it. Some side views. And another view. As you can well imagine, her work, celebrated as it has been, has received a lot of criticism, and often, particularly by Black artists who feel that in using this kind of imagery, she is catering somehow to the white art world. I don't know. So how do you top this? What do you do after you've done the subtlety? Well, she created a work in 2020 for the Turban Hall at the Tate. She made a giant sculptural monument based on and as a response to the Victoria Memorial that's in front of Buckingham Palace, which she first saw while she was in a taxi on her way to the airport. I hadn't even seen it before, she said. I took a bunch of pictures out the window because I was like, this is totally my thing. So this original Victoria Memorial was funded by gifts from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, along with the wealth produced in West Africa. In response, Walker created a half-size counter memorial titled Fons Americanus, the Fountain of America, as an offering from a colonial subject, sort of as was the original, but this has kind of a different lens used on it. And it's called A Gift and Talisman for the Citizens of the Old World, Our Captors, Saviors, and Intimate Family from that celebrated negress of the New World, Madame Cara E. Walker. So rather than a celebration of the British Empire, as was the original, Walker's Fountain explores the interconnected histories of Africa, America, and Europe, with water as a key theme, of course, referring to the transatlantic slave trade and the fates of people of these 3 continents. So in creating this, she's incorporated imagery from dozens of sources, from Delacroix and Matisse to photographs of former slavery sites. She noticed that in a painting by Winslow Homer called The Gulf Stream, the boat with the sharks around it is labeled Key West. In her sculpture, there's a similar image, but the boat is labeled K West, so maybe it's Kanye West, I don't know. She's also sculpted a Pietà scene in which a male figure lifts a body whose mangled face clearly makes reference to Emmett Till. And the sea captain on the front of the monument here is modeled after Toussaint Louverture, the Black Haitian leader who became a dictator. Now, despite its size, this work has a more intimate kind of handmade feel than a subtlety did. She crafted the figures in clay tabletop versions that were molded, coated, then fed through a digital milling program to a robot that reproduced the shapes from bricks of Portuguese cork chosen for its environmental sustainability. Then she had artisans who coated the pieces with a plaster and resin composite to mimic the color of London's buildings. Now, between these monumental projects, she still works on a smaller scale doing drawings, for instance, like this one, which is called Daylight, and it's actually also an homage to Max Beckmann, drawing and working with the subjects that she has really made her own. So finally, let's look at another woman artist, artist of color from South America. And that's Doris Salcedo. And just as the mention of Stone Mountain, Georgia, gave you a clue to Kara Walker's abiding concerns, the fact that Salcedo is from Bogota, Colombia, makes you think of what? Drug cartels, civil war, the disappeared, and indeed her sculptural and installation works respond to the human cost of these disruptions in her homeland. So her work is about memory and how the disappeared retain a presence even in their absence. So let's hear what Salcedo, who just last year won the first $1 million Nomura Art Award, feels about her position in the art world. So we have to wait. Oh, very good. That didn't take too long. Paging YouTube here. Here we go.
I was actually born in the wrong place. And from the wrong place, I work. I was born in Colombia. It's a country that is not respected. It's considered a drug trafficking, brutal land. So if 100 people get killed in Colombia, you don't read that in the papers because we don't quite have the status of human beings. So I know what being excluded is. I have experienced racism. I have a thick accent. I'm dark. I'm female. I'm from Colombia. I have the wrong passport. So that gives me a huge, huge range of experience. As an artist coming from the third world, we have very little access to see original works of art. So you do everything through books. And that makes a huge difference because we don't have great museums with great collections. So you have more of a theoretical approach to works of art. Also, related to that, I'd like to say that since I come from the third world, we have this inferiority complex that I find is a privilege because we don't have a mainstream culture. We have not produced great masters in art history. So it's really a lot of, it gives freedom in that sense. And also it gives us the opportunity, we have not the opportunity, we're forced to reach out, to look towards Europe and the States and other countries. It's all very good. It's all very important. And I treasure all that. I don't think that an artist is a person that has huge talent and huge intelligence and then is inspired and then produces an extraordinary work of art. I don't believe that. I believe an artist is a very humble person that has to study and has to work hard and in order to be able to connect different experiences, human experiences, and then poetry, and then philosophy, and then different fields of human knowledge. And then you web all that into a work of art.
Okay. So you can see she has a completely different idea about what an artist is and where artistic talent comes from than the Renaissance thinkers who Linda Nochlin was responding to. So Salcedo was born in Bogota, here it is, in 1958, studied painting and theater at the university there. And from the start, she was interested in the subversive artists of the 20th century, like Marcel Duchamp and Joseph Beuys. She went to New York to do an MFA at NYU, hoping to engage in a more active, exciting art scene. But as she suggested in the clip that you just saw, she felt that ironically, her experience in Colombia was richer than what she found in New York. So she returned to Colombia and began her career at a moment when violence was resurging in Bogota, including a takeover of the Palace of Justice by guerrillas in 1985. And her art practice, her political concerns, and her empathy for the victims of violence and those they leave behind are completely intertwined. Her artwork memorializes the victims of violence, but it does not depict violence. Bodies are never shown, nor are any weapons or instruments of abuse. Instead, she collects elements that were part of the every life of Colombia's victims: chairs, tables, beds, dressers, shoes, clothes, and transforms them into memorials. The single chair associated, of course, with an individual's place at the table, the family table, is a frequent element. So the objects are often dismembered and recombined, kind of a crazy craft project, using less permanent materials like wax, fabric, animal fibers, and sometimes the most permanent of all, which is concrete. She uses that as well. So in this work from 1988, the bars of this baby crib have been replaced by steel mesh plus fabric and wax. And it forms a cage that, on the one hand, would be supremely uncomfortable, but it's impregnable. A baby would be safe in there. Another approach she took in early works, she has these stacks of folded white shirts that are stiffened with a coat of plaster, impaled on metal spikes, from a couple of dozen shirts to 50 sometimes shirts high. And here's some of her concrete chairs and wardrobes. And just as a comparison, here's a work by Joseph Beuys, whom I mentioned, the German artist whose work she refers to a lot. He does these things with lard and felt, creates these images that relate to his past, something that happened to him. Now, this work called Unland, the Orphan's Tunic, looks like just a plain table. Actually, it's two tables that have been cut apart and put together, covered with a whitish kind of veil of fabric, which I guess is the orphan's tunic. But when you look closer, you can see that the fabric is attached with hundreds of small human hairs, attaching it to the table. Now, Salcedo conducts extensive research and interviews survivors to figure out the extent of the victim's loss. And she's visited the sites of massacres and mass graves. And her research has indicated that female victims were treated with particular cruelty and that shoes were often used to identify remains. So that is the source of this work called Atribularios from the early 90s, in which she uses shoes encased in niches embedded in a gallery wall, covered by a layer of preserved animal fiber, I think it's pig's stomach, sutured to the wall with medical sutures. And she also includes in the exhibition, so there you can see the niches on the wall, but these are empty boxes made of the same animal fiber that perhaps anticipate more deaths to come. Another work that's similar to this is Plegaria Muda, Silent Prayer, which is a series of sculptural figures, each composed of two tables, handcrafted tables, which together are approximately the same shape and size of a coffin. One's upside down on the other with an earth-like layer in between, with grass that grows up between the boards on the tabletop. This was designed as an homage to the mass grave sites where victims of gang violence are often buried. And this was shown at SF MoMA a couple of years ago. It was in a room by itself, and you walked through it, finding a sort of path between these objects. So her work, though, has become increasingly installation-based, often using locations, of course, that are politically and historically charged. For example, Noviembre 6 y 7 from 2002. Oh, so there's the grass. You see, sometimes it grows. So something sprouting from this dead and disastrous situation. All right, here's Noviembre, 6 y 7. This work commemorates the 17th anniversary of that seizing of the Supreme Court in Bogota by guerrillas in 1985. This is the new Palace of Justice, and she installed this work in 53 hours, which is the length of time that the original siege lasted, by lowering these chairs from different points on the roof. And this work, Istanbul, uses even more chairs, 1,550 chairs, to represent kind of war in general. And she's quoted as saying, "Seeing these chairs piled high between two buildings in central Istanbul, I'm reminded of mass graves." And of course, they reference both victims and survivors. And interestingly, in 2007, Ai Weiwei likewise used chairs in his piece Fairy Tale, 1001 Ming and Qing Dynasty Chairs, that was at Documenta 12 in Kassel, Germany. And like Kara Walker, Doris Salcedo has also done a commission for the Turban Hall at the Tate in London. She did hers in 2007, and it's called Shibboleth. So what she did was not install something in the building, she actually changed the physical building. She opened up a wound, we could say, in the floor that stretched the entire length of the hall, over 500 feet, I believe it is. And the concrete walls of the crevice, here's a kind of closer version, were ruptured by a steel mesh fence. The installation began as a thin, almost invisible line at the main entrance and gradually widens into this chasm by the far end. So what's going on here? Brokenness and separateness of post-colonial cultures, perhaps, especially in her homeland of Colombia. She focuses attention on a large, socially excluded underclass present in all societies. And she's breaking the floor in this temple of Western art, symbolizing perhaps a fracture in modernity itself. The crack was repaired at the conclusion of the show, yet there's a sliver that will always be there in the floor. And this one is called, what do you think? Gosh, what could that be? This is called Flor de Piel. It's a room-size installation, first exhibited at the Harvard Art Museum when she had a solo exhibition there in 2016. This is a tapestry of thousands of preserved, hand-sewn red rose petals. It's a shroud for a nurse who was tortured to death in Colombia during the war. And she's got another emotional use of flowers. She filled the streets of Bogota with a 2-mile path of red roses to commemorate the assassination of a Colombian journalist in 1999. Now, in June last year, Salcedo staged the newest installment in the series Acts of Mourning, which are short-term, large-scale works made in collaboration with thousands of people and intended to help those who are grappling with trauma and loss of the 5-decade civil war in Colombia. So this one is called Quebrantos, it means broken or shattered, and it spells out the names of murdered Colombians in a large plaza in the center of Bogota. And it was for this work that she won the first Nomura Prize, an award designed to support artists who have created a body of work of major cultural significance to enable them to pursue ambitious projects that they otherwise would not have been able to realize. So she says she was going to use the funds to bring the series to really remote regions of Colombia that have been really hard hit by this ongoing conflict. And she says, I think we need to recover the dignity of victims and recover this terrain, be able to walk on it and do something that dignifies the memories of the victims and the life experiences of the survivors. I don't know exactly the shape it will take, she says. I just know that it will be like an ephemeral, performative piece. These places that most of us have never heard of, they deserve art, she says. I actually think that's where art is needed most. So, with these 3 powerful prize-winning artists and many, many others making statements and getting noticed, it sounds like equality has been gained for women artists. Well, not quite so fast. I don't want to leave you with too rosy a picture. After all, the Guerrilla Girls are still in business 40 years on, putting up hundreds of images like this one and staging interventions at museums, deriding not just gender bias in museums, but any sort of inequality, including the hijacking of the art world by the super rich, which we all know about. In American museums generally, works by female artists make up just 11% of all acquisitions and 14% of exhibitions. The mighty Metropolitan Art can boast only 7.3% of its collection is by women artists. Of course, museums with the highest percentage of women artists tend to be contemporary. LA MoCA has 25%. The Whitney and SF MoMA are kind of at 20%. Even UK's National Portrait Gallery, which this last year had its first ever exhibit devoted to a woman artist, and you probably know it was Artemisia Gentileschi, they have announced an effort to strengthen their holdings, both of women artists and of women subjects. Although right now, 12% of their works are by women, so that's not as bad as some places. In 2017, for example, of 14 solo shows at SF MoMA, 64% went to male artists. So not equal, but it's not that bad. So the tide slowly is changing. And last year, Phaidon published this work, Great Women Artists, a massive volume illustrating the artistic work of 400 women, which was whittled down from a list of 1,000 names. So if you get a hold of this, you might find a new favorite in it. Like, I don't know, like Lubiana Hamid, right? There's a work called Naming the Money.
Avril, I'm sorry to interrupt. There is a question in the chat.
Okay.
Judith is asked, it says, thank you for this very interesting presentation. Does Doris make all of these herself or does she have assistants?
Oh.
This question was from several slides ago. Sorry, I was like trying to jump in and sorry about that.
I mean, how you make these kinds of works, yes, she does certainly have assistants. And by the time you're getting to stacking up 1,500 chairs between two buildings, you're working with cranes and this and that. So art nowadays is far removed. I mean, there certainly are people who paint on canvas, absolutely, but it requires, some of these things require a great deal of preparation, planning, assistance. So yeah, I think certainly at the beginning, her smaller work, she did those by hand. But yes, she has assistants and she has big machines probably to help her. I don't even know how they created the crack in the floor at the Tate. I don't even know how you would do that, but she managed to anyway. So yeah, thank you. That's an interesting aspect about contemporary art is how large and project-based so much of it is. Okay, well, let's just finish up here. So you might like Lubiana Hamid. You might discover the work of Lois Mailu Jones. I believe SF MoMA just acquired one of her works. Or Lisa Rihanna, who's an artist from New Zealand. This is a 64-minute video work, giant thing called In Pursuit of Venus. It's actually based on a French 18th century wallpaper depicting a similar scene. Or you might like to see what women are doing in the realm of painting nudes, because that's a big thrill, that's a big interest. So you might actually like the work of Sylvia Slay here with Imperial Nude Paul Rossano. So there's lots of things to see. Roberta Smith, the critic in the Times, just said not too long ago, the past is becoming increasingly feminine, increasingly female, and so is the present. So very good. I will click this off and stop the share. And if there are any other kinds of questions, I'd be happy to answer them or try to. Oh, right on time.
All right, hi, welcome. Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Avril. That was a lovely presentation, so fascinating. Does anybody have any questions? If you would like, you can raise your hand physically or use the raise hand function in Zoom or type it into the chat and we'll Avril might have answers.
I might have answers or I might not.
Well, while we're waiting, I'm going to just, if people are typing in, I'll just say a few things. I want to, again, thank Avril for being here with us today and giving this presentation. We are being recorded right now, and I will send the link to everybody who registered, hopefully later today. And so if you missed part of it, or if you couldn't make it for half of it, then I will send it out to you. So no worries about that. Hi, Lisa. She's okay. We have to clap.
Oh, thank you, Dodie. I know Dodie.
Alexandra said that please note that Columbia has no U in it. So